about to join Don Neuen, co-host of Cowboy Logic Radio, and Denise Simon, host of the Denise Simon Experience, for a weekly situation report, or SITREP. 18 hours a day, Denise Simon lives her life as an Intel Analyst. 18 hours a day, Don Neuen lives his life in the world of rock and roll. 1 hour each day, Neuen receives a daily SITREP from Simon. Welcome to the Drive Time Situation Report. Fasten your seatbelt. You're now in Don Neuen's car, and he is calling in for his SITREP.
Hello.
What's up, Niecy? It's your buddy Don.
Hi, Don.
Happy Merry Christmas, Denise.
Yeah. Same at you.
All right. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to tonight's Drive Time Sit Rep. For those of you that have just joined us for the first time, Denise and I wish each other Merry Christmas every Drive Time Sit Rep, because the Obama administration and the left-wing radical nutcases are no longer in control, and we can celebrate Christmas from outside of the shadows that we had to celebrate throughout the 8-year term of Barack Obama. So we just wish each other Merry Christmas, and we celebrate Christmas every day of the year. And for our Jewish friends, we celebrate Hanukkah, by gosh. So, Denise.
Yes.
Let's see, I've welcomed everybody to the sit rep. I explained the Merry Christmas shtick.
Yes.
And I don't even know where to begin, Denise.
All right, well, let's do it this way. It's 8:34 p.m. Eastern on the 9th day of September in the year of our Lord 2019. So we'll start there because officially...
Hold on, before you get into that, I know. By the time this show airs on Wednesday night, it will be 9/11.
Yeah, that too.
So we need to remember that. Okay?
Yes.
All right. So sorry I interrupted you, but that was a pretty important interruption. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Drive Time Sit Rep with Denise Simon. My name is Don Neuen, and we are going to get after it now.
Yeah, and I think we should actually start with 9/11 because we tend to forget that we have the Gen X generation who was either one, too young, or two, not even born when we were attacked on 9/11. And unless they would necessarily go over to the Nat Geo channel on cable, or American Heroes channel, or the History channel, or they would go, look some things up on YouTube, they probably wouldn't know all of the details that they need to know. And I would argue that the burden of that day actually fell on Vice President Dick Cheney. Mostly because George Bush was in Sarasota, which happens to be kind of my hometown. And when this thing happened, the Secret Service and a lot of people in Washington, D.C. said, dude, you're not coming back to Washington, D.C. You're going to have to go someplace else. If for nothing else, you might have to just stay in the skies for a while. So he ended up at 2 Air Force bases that day, trying to get a handle on things and determine what was fact, what was just being reported, because there was so much panic in media. There was so much panic in Secret Service. There was so much panic in CIA, National Security Council, State Department. I mean, everybody was in a panic. So nobody knew what to do because we had never been in a situation like this before. But I would also argue at the time, Air Force One did not have the communications technology on the aircraft that it does today. So George Bush is in the air and has no way to communicate with anybody. So the burdens really fell on those at the White House. And what's particularly interesting that the young generation, including I would say maybe even some millennials, they need to remember that Secret Service came in and virtually escorted those that needed to stay at the White House and pushed them and said, you've got to go down to what is known as the POC, which is the Presidential Emergency Operations Center. And the rest of everybody else had to leave. You had to go because there were reports that there were more planes that were going to hit the Capitol building and or the White House. At least that. So one of the more chilling things that we tend to forget is when it came to Flight 93, the one that ended up crashing into Shanksville, Pennsylvania, that was the plane that was kind of unaccounted for. We knew about it, and Dick Cheney on, I think 3 times, he was asked by our pilots if he was confirming that they had the permission to shoot down a passenger jet. And Cheney said yes, 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 and yes, and yes. So it was probably the decision that Dick Cheney had to make that he never thought he would have to make. But once he made it, imagine how those pilots felt. I think there were 2 of them at the time in the air. That may have to happen. And we also had the Secretary of Transportation that was at the White House too at the time, Norm Mineta. And Norm Mineta was looking at the television feeds, and he was virtually writing down tail numbers of everything that he could see or get his hands on, because he's trying to account for planes himself. They had to identify planes. And that was probably the more Herculean task. A lot of people don't know this, but that was I think the first time ever that we had grounded all aircraft in the United States. And I think they were grounded for 3 days. Do you remember if that was the case or not?
I do. My office at the time was in line with Hartsfield Atlanta Airport, and so I constantly was aware of aircraft that was coming in and out of Atlanta. I remember those following days, whether it was 2, 3, I don't recall.
Yeah, I don't.
Where the skies were silent.
And here's what's remarkable: when the orders went to the FAA and all the towers had to get to every aircraft, regardless of the size, regardless of the tail number, regardless of the carrier. They just said, you really have about 2 hours to find a runway and land. And what was fascinating is the pilots and the carriers complied, and they ended up, a lot of planes had to land in places that the pilots had never been before, wasn't sure that the runways could take them, wasn't sure that the airports knew what to do, wasn't sure that the air traffic controllers knew what to do. But I mean, they went to places with passengers, I might add. If you were leaving, say, Philadelphia, and you were going to, say, Tulsa, but you ended up in Omaha or you ended up in Chicago, as a passenger, you were stuck. You couldn't leave. You were there at least 3 days because nothing was going to lift you back out of that airport and take you where you needed to go. So not only did we have planes stuck, We had business people stuck. We had passengers that were stuck. We had, it was really quite the remarkable thing.
My phones lit up.
Yeah.
Because I'm in the transportation industry, busing, rock and roll buses, and you would not believe the number of people that were giving me a call trying to get people out of wherever they were. I mean, because I predominantly deal with rock stars, I had rock stars calling me trying to figure out a way to get their elderly parents out of the metropolitan DC area. And in certain, and I'm not going to mention names, but in certain situations, I had very high profile rock and rollers riding around on buses with moms and dads of other very high profile rock and rollers. I mean, it was a bizarre time. Earth, Wind and Fire. I was on tour with them. They were actually headed up into the New York or Boston, the Northeast area. And when this hit, they instructed the drivers, it was, 5, 6 buses, whatever it was, turn around and just start driving west. Just drive. Get us out of here. It was an unbelievable 72 plus 96 hours. Denise, I wanted to ask you a question about Flight 93.
Mm-hmm.
Did the fighter jets that were on standby to take that plane out escort it to its death?
No.
At what point did they peel away and decide not to do that?
They didn't even go that direction.
All right. Explain to me then, what was Cheney telling them?
Well, they had, it says here, Colonel Matthew Kimmo, who was the executive assistant to the vice chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the time, was General Richard Myers of the Pentagon. No one had ever contemplated the need to shoot down a civilian airliner. Major General Larry Arnold, who was at the NORAD headquarters, said, we have to have permission. We may have to shoot down this aircraft that is coming towards Washington, D.C. We need presidential authority. Major Dan Kane, an F-16 pilot, he said he handed our wing commander the phone to talk to the highest levels of government to get the rules of engagement. Dick Cheney said it had to be done once the plane became hijacked, even if it had a load of passengers on board who obviously weren't part of any hijacking attempt. Having seen what had happened in New York and the Pentagon, you really didn't have any choice. It wasn't a close call. And so this really kind of grabs you. Now, those two planes, those two fighter jets, actually went out over the Atlantic because they were getting such bad information. There was even a Flight 617 that was being mentioned. So there was massive confusion, but it wasn't necessarily Flight 93. It could have been anything because we didn't know. And it says here, with the orders given from Vice President Dick Cheney, the military scrambled to find fighters it could bring into the fight, even if that meant launching them unarmed on a kamikaze mission to crash their own fighters into hijacked airliners. The scrambled fighter jets would never make contact with Flight 93, the passengers of the crew. And at the same time, they were necessarily planning to take the plane down themselves. So I actually have the call here where Lieutenant Heather Penny, her name is Lucky Penny, the F-16 pilot from the D.C. Air National Guard, she said, what are the things I need to do enable to us to protect our capital? What are the things I need to do to facilitate us getting airborne? Because remember, you've got to go through 3 or 4 hours of pre-flight check controls before you can even put a plane on a runway. And they had to, they don't have ordnance on them. Do you, if they don't have ordnance, what do? Do you ram the tail off the aircraft and you bail out in a parachute? You see what I'm saying? I mean, it was nuts.
Yeah.
So you can imagine Cheney was kind of like, hey, you got the approval. Now, I don't know what the 113th wing of the Andrews Air Force Base is going to do. I don't know what the Air National Guard is going to do. I don't know what you guys got to all work it out with air traffic control. But I'm telling you, at one point, Lieutenant Heather Lucky Penny said, I just got my radios up. I was yelling at my crew chief, pull the chocks, meaning the chalk blocks. He pulled the chocks. I pushed my throttle. The crew chief was still running under the tail so that my gear would come up. There are safety pins that are all over the plane. And so they were pulling out all those safety pins as I was taxiing to do an immediate takeoff. I didn't even have inertia navigation unit with her. I didn't have any of that set up. It was lucky it was a clear blue sky day because we didn't have all the avionics. They were just not awake yet when we took off. Can you imagine?
Wow.
Can you imagine this?
No, I can't.
So
I cannot.
We are at a. She goes on to say that it was surreal. It was totally surreal to see this billowing smoke. We didn't get that high. We were about 3,000 feet. We never got above 3,000 sweep, at least on that first sweep out. Now this is going over the Pentagon, but again, they were going towards the Atlantic. Because they didn't know, is Flight 93 accounted for, not accounted for? What about these other planes?
Well, they didn't even know what their potential targets would be.
That's right. Because remember, Flight 93 took a weird turn. And where were these planes headed?
Help me remember, Flight 93, when it crashed, did it crash going west? What direction was it going in? For some reason, I feel like it was going in a westerly direction.
It looked like they were about to make the turn. It was going west, and they were about to make the turn to go back towards Washington D.C. When it went into when I think it was Todd Beamer and Tom Burnett.
Let's roll.
Yeah, they stormed the cockpit. And somehow, I don't know if it was lucky or what, but there were some communications that people on board were able to use the Verizon airphones and talk to operators or talk to somebody at the airport or the flight attendants. I mean, there was so much panic, Don, that was going on that day. You didn't know if there was a bomb on board. You didn't know if they were just going to kamikaze the plane. I mean, we can never know the confusion and we can never know the fear.
Well, I want to share, since we're probably going to focus the greatest part of this show on 9/11, some heroes of 9/11 that are within my own family. Donna's cousin, her first cousin, Peter Kavickia, was career Secret Service. His two sons, Paul and Peter, followed in their dad's footsteps, and they became Secret Service agents. And they were stationed in Building 7 when the attacks hit. So they immediately came out of the building and raced over to the towers to do what they could do. And one of the boys, Peter, I believe, They both had cell phones, but we have to remember that this was 2000, 2001, 2002, in that time frame when cell phones were not what they are now. And he ended up getting trapped, and by the way, both boys survived. Okay, there is a happy ending to this story. But when he was trapped in some rubble, he accidentally pocket dialed the last person that he had spoken to, and it happened to be his mother, who was living in northern New Jersey. So his mom's watching all this unfold on television, gets a pocket dial phone call from one of her sons who doesn't realize that he's called her. And in the background, she's hearing the chaos of this tragedy take place. People saying, Pete, you okay? You okay, Pete? Where are you, Pete? Can you imagine what went through Mom's mind?
No.
And again, they were lucky. They got out of this. They're both alive right now. I can't imagine what thousands of people, tens of thousands of people, went through on that day. Because, we lose over 3,000. You multiply that times 3 or 4 family members for each one of those people. We're talking tens of thousands of people went through with anxiety and horror and devastation. I mean, it was bad enough for those of us that didn't have a family member in any of those 3 locations. I mean, it goes without saying, I know exactly where I was when I learned of this. I can shut my eyes and I can see where I was. I cannot imagine being any closer to this than I already am. I can't relate to the pain and the horror and the anguish and the just the terrifying feeling that these poor people, the survivors, had to go through.
The burden of some of the decisions, the burden of trying to find people, the burden of having to work those sites is unthinkable. And when we say never forget, it isn't a matter that we were attacked on 9/11. It is the emotional trauma that people went through whose stories have probably, some of them have never been told, including those, I might add, that the surviving families found out that their loved one jumped from the towers to their death. And we don't know that number. I don't think we ever got an accurate number on how many did jump.
It's horrific. Hold that thought, Denise. Ladies and gentlemen, you're listening to a 9/11 episode of the Drive Time Sit Rep. Denise and I will never be able to do this event justice, this tragedy justice. And you're not supposed to leave dead air when you do a radio show.
Oh.
My name is Don Neuen. You're listening to the Drive Time Sit Rep. We're going to take a break. You got Denise Simon on the other end of this conversation. And when we get back, I'm pretty confident that we're just going to pick up where we left off. You're listening to the Drive Time Sit Rep.
Check us out on the web at cowboylogic.us.
Welcome back to the Drive Time SITREP, ladies and gentlemen. You've got Denise Simon, host of the Denise Simon Experience, on one end of this conversation. My name is Don Neuen. I am the co-host of Cowboy Logic Radio. We're remembering 9/11. Denise, I will let you pick back up with this.
Well, as I mentioned, we had the two pilots that were working pretty hard to get the approval if they had to take down a plane. Again, there was no weapons, there were no ordnance on those planes. So these two pilots, after they got the approval, the burden was on them on what were they going to do. So they themselves became the weapon, if need be. If need be. So you had these two pilots, one being a female, little Miss Heather.
Let me ask you something real quick, because you're a student of military history. Has there been a time that you're aware of in which military fighter pilots have knowingly entered into what could be potential combat with the only weapon that they have is that of turning their jet or plane into a weapon itself and becoming a kamikaze?
Well, the Japanese were doing it to us, and there were a lot of times.
I know that. I'm talking about Americans.
As I was getting ready to say, there were times that we had to do it in return. And we did have the abilities, however, that we would jump out of a plane. We would put the plane on its course, and I don't know how many times that it certainly happened, but yeah, I mean, you would necessarily, put the plane on the course to go through the deck of a Japanese carrier or some kind of a warship, and the pilot would bail out. Only to necessarily understand that they may be floating out there in some crazy place for days or forever because they couldn't find them to recover them.
Right.
So and then if you ever looked at some of the things that really happened during the attack on Pearl Harbor, you had guys on the ground that had really no protection. They were being dive bombed. They were you had, strafing was going on like crazy, not to mention the torpedoes that were being dropped and coming in. You had no idea where they were going to go. And you had guys on the ground, standing there in their boxer shorts, with some kind of, ground to air guns trying to shoot these planes. So we can never know that kind of valor to the point where, like, here you have this pilot, Heather Penny, who said to her wingman, "Here's what I'll do. I'll take, you take the cockpit and I'll take the tail of whatever plane that they were forced to take down." So, these are the piece parts of the stories, the collection. It isn't just about the firefighters in New York, or about those at the Pentagon that had to go through fire in order to rescue their fellow, military personnel that were in a building that was virtually on fire too. But you've got air traffic controllers, you have got pilots, you have got FBI, you've got Secret Service, you've got national security people, you've got domestic military bases. Nobody knew anything. And when you say never again, that's really the larger part of the component. We will never be that unprepared that vulnerable that those kind of decisions would have to be made, where two fighter pilots were really having to make the decision to turn themselves into kamikaze pilots themselves because they had no ordnance on their planes.
Well, and the other thing that we so often forget is that the number of heroes from 9/11 is quite staggering in its number. Clearly we remember the victims of 9/11. Clearly we remember the families of the victims of 9/11. Clearly we remember the NYPD, the fire department in New York, everything that was going on in D.C. We remember all of those first responder heroes. But there are so many people that are heroes of 9/11 that we never know about. You made me think about a bunch of them right then. And the hero of 9/11 that were absolutely chastised and belittled by the media, like them or not, what you just said about Dick Cheney, would you want that, any of our listeners, would you want that decision on your shoulders? Would you want that unbelievable burden on your shoulders to have to make that type of a decision, and you don't have time to think it through?
Well, all I can say is this. I'm glad it was Dick Cheney and not somebody else. Because Dick Cheney, this wasn't his really, his first kind of rodeo, if you will. I mean, he'd been through this kind of training. There have been plots and practices and so forth and so on. So imagine if it wasn't Dick Cheney that was there that day. Suppose it was Al Gore.
I don't even want to go there.
So, maybe there was the blessing right there, because Dick Cheney was, he was really ended up kind of being a master at all of this, giving remarkable direction. And it's also fascinating too. We forget who was in the White House at the time. There were some fascinating people that were there, including, I might say, Condoleezza Rice, again, Normanetta, Richard Clark, Mary Madeline. There was a whole, Karen Hughes. We forget about the other people, Scooter Libby. So imagine if this had been another administration.
Yeah, I don't think I'd like to.
No.
Denise, you've had a lot of years here to evaluate 9/11 and the reasons that it happened, the way it did. And I'm not interested in trying to pass blame, but in your opinion, why did 9/11 happen?
Well, when it comes right down to it, sadly so, and admittedly so, because he has admitted it, the lack of attention and the mistakes were made during the Clinton administration. Everything was very much downplayed, because it was when the first plane hit, it raised an eyebrow, but when the second plane hit, anybody that was in the previous administration or in the intelligence wing of the Bush administration, everybody knew that it was Al Qaeda. Everybody knew it was bin Laden in a New York second. So that tells you that this thing, and if you look closely, I think it goes actually back to around 1996 when the Bojinka plot was uncovered. I think, where was that, in the Philippines? That was really the beginning, and that whole thing, from that moment, with the intelligence that we had gathered from the Philippines, from the Ramzi Youssefs, and whose uncle, by the way, is who? Khalik Sheikh Mohammed, who is sitting today in Guantanamo.
All right, hold your thought right there, ladies and gentlemen. And Denise, you're going to know why I'm going to bring this up. Ladies and gentlemen, I really encourage you to check out and read a book by a good friend of Donna and mine, as well as Denise. And that's the book by Dr. James Mitchell. I don't have a copy of the book in front of me, Denise. I'm in my car, but it's Enhanced Interrogation. What's the subtitle of the book? I know you got it in your library there.
Yeah.
And while she's looking for that, ladies and gentlemen, here's the thing. Our friend Dr. Mitchell helped develop the enhanced interrogation process that was used on the high-value detainees. KSM, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, being probably the most recognizable, but Youssef as well. And it's a fascinating book because he actually gets into the minds over thousands of hours of interrogations of these detainees. He gets into the mind of the terrorists. And you will learn things in that book that are absolutely jaw-dropping. If you're able to watch videos of Dr. Mitchell giving speeches about this, one of which was in January of 2018 in South Carolina at the South Carolina Tea Party Coalition Convention, please do so. But buy the book. It's terrifying, but it's also really insightful on what's going on in these guys' minds that are putting together these acts of horrific evil. When Dr. Mitchell signed his copy of his book that he gave to Donna and me, he basically said, monsters really do exist. That was the inscription. Denise, do you have the title of the book?
Yeah, it's Enhanced Interrogations Inside the Minds and Motives of Islamic Terrorists Trying to Destroy America.
You can find this on Amazon. Ladies and gentlemen, I really encourage you to pick this book up. And the reason is because with me.
we have declared a victory over Islamic State, but that's only in the territory, the real estate they had control over. You haven't cured, you haven't fixed, and you haven't been able to claim victory over the minds and motives of Islamic terrorists, what I call militant Islam. We haven't done that. And as long as we're having these discussions where, Trump has said that he has terminated the peace talks with the Taliban, which was fine with me. I said, excellent. And that we want to get out of Afghanistan, we do. But the reality is this. We've been in South Korea with about 25,000 troops since, I don't know, we called a ceasefire. We don't have 25,000 troops in Afghanistan. And I don't think that North Korea poses the kind of threat to South Korea that Afghanistan, Islamic State, Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, Haqqani, and the rest of them posed and still do pose to the Western world out of Afghanistan. So the moral of all of this is inside the minds and motives has not, Mitchell's right. Dr. Mitchell's right. That's going to be here, and it's a generational thing. It's not just a couple of decades. You may have 40 or 50 years until this whole thing is defeated, and we need to admit that.
If that. When you read this book, ladies and gentlemen, you're going to see this is no quick fix. None. I'm not sure there is a fix.
No.
There's not a fix. There's defensive measures that can be taken. But one of the things that Dr. Mitchell talks about in this book is his objective was not to find out why and how they did it. He was really only concerned about preventing any further acts that were going to kill Americans. That's what he was charged with doing. Prevent it from happening again.
And so if we go back to the Bojinka plot, which happened in January of 1995 in the Philippines, we knew once we had gotten some cooperation and some information out of Ramzi Youssef and those conspirators in Manila that they had aimed to blow up 11 U.S.-bound trans-Pacific airliners with virtually undetectable bombs. Now, that tells us where we are with TSA today. So it's with us. This has become a part of life. This has turned our once peaceful world that we knew in the 60s and, 80s and whatnot upside down. And this is our way of life. Yes.
It's gone. That, many times have you seen people say that day changed the face of our nation. And
it's that cannot be driven home, I think, enough. And so I guess that's what makes me kind of angry is that under the Obama administration, we gave up 8 years because of lax rules of engagement. I think we could have been 8 years ahead of where we are today if we weren't just doing management and training and, that kind of stuff. So while the Democrats don't want to spend the money on war and, with the military and the Pentagon, what else are you going to do? Unless you decide that you're going to defeat what Dr. Mitchell has illustrated that's beyond really any argument because of his interviewing not only Khalik Sheikh Mohammed, but the others. So this is where we are. And
well, it's again, and we'll move away from Mitchell's book at this point, ladies and gentlemen. You get it. Now go get it. Just buy the book. It's that simple. Denise, one of the biggest losses outside of obviously human life on 9/11 that I think has impacted every citizen in the United States is that because of that horrific event, we collectively have lost an enormous amount of freedom and liberty. Do you want to expand on that?
Well, a lot of people will never get over the fact that those that were paying attention is the Patriot Act, where we had surveillance on all things United States and globally from communications between the United States and whatever foreign countries and coming back again. And then we had the invention of TSA and, cameras, surveillance and all these other. So we have given up a lot for the sake of safety. Now, I will say, under the Patriot Act, several of those clauses, several of those piece parts of the Patriot Act, after a while had expiration dates to them. When Obama came into office, he resurrected those. So, and we don't know necessarily all those reasons. But look, the world is ugly. And I look at that every day, how ugly this world really is. And it doesn't seem to get any less ugly. I mean, the equilibrium has gone from ugly to political correctness. So that's a whole nother component. But we have Islamic State, we have Syria, we have Lebanon, we have Iran, we have North Korea, we have got Iraq, we've got Afghanistan, we've got Somalia, we've got Sudan. I mean, we can go on and on and on. The United States is still really the only country that's taking any of this very seriously, because I don't believe our friends and partners, as they like to say over in Europe, are taking it as seriously as we are. We are first there. Now, everybody says we can't be the world's police. Well, somebody has to be the police. And if we weren't, imagine where we would be.
Well, the thing is, they don't want us to be the world's police, but they expect us to be the world's police.
Yes. So, yeah.
Yeah, but the thing is, a lot of these younger people, including my two boys, they don't know the kind of liberty and true freedom that people like you and me and Donna and many of our beloved listeners know that predates 9/11.
No, I was actually thinking about that a little bit today with an interview that I did for my own show. There was a time that we could go out and play and we could go do whatever it was that we wanted to do. We just had to be home by dark. Or you had to be home for dinner, and after dinner you could go right back out again. Right. And we played in our bare feet. We played in the mud. We went over to the park. We rode our bicycles wherever we wanted to. And there was never a worry. We can't do that anymore.
No, but I mean, even with traveling,
yep.
I remember as a kid, I remember as a young adult doing business traveling, and leading up to the years before 9/11, flying was
easy.
Was actually enjoyable.
Yeah, you could get on a plane. You could buy the ticket and get on the plane in 5 minutes. Can't do that now.
Well, or you could go say goodbye to a loved one.
Yeah, at the gate.
Exactly, instead of the curb. Times have changed, and sadly, our young people never got to experience that level of liberty and freedom.
Correct. And so I would say Osama bin Laden and your colleague Sheikh Mohammed's, they knew us better than we knew ourselves, and they knew how to hurt us, and they did.
Yeah. We got about 4 minutes left, Denise.
All right, well, in this 4 minutes, go ahead.
Well, let me fire a quick question at you. Who or what, and I think I know the answer to this question, at least I know what my answer would be, who or what has filled the void of Osama bin Laden?
Well, I don't think that there's any one person.
Well, that's why I said who or what.
You have Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, and if for nothing else, I would certainly point to all things Iran right now.
That would have been my answer. My answer would have been, it's not a who, it's a what. I think, and please pick up where I interrupted you, but maybe something for next week we can talk about. I got a feeling that things are going to get extremely hot around the collar with regard to Israel and Iran here very soon.
Well, let me leave you and the listeners with two things, because Congress comes back officially tomorrow. They're all flying in today, looking at calendars and schedules and whatnot. And so two things are, two pieces of legislation are sitting on everybody's desk right now. One is H.R. 1186, which is the Keep Americans Safe Act, introduced by a Democrat, Ted Deutsch, which is a iteration of Red Flag. The other one is H.R. 1236, titled the Extreme Risk Protection Order Act of 2019. Again, introduced by a Democrat. These are both have co-sponsors, and they have been presented to the House Judiciary Committee, who is chaired by whom? Jerry Nadler.
Yeah.
And so I would encourage the listeners to go take a long look at HR 1236 and HR 1186. Both of them we're not going to like when it comes to the Democrats' concept of red flag. And we have red flag laws out there now. I think 19 or 20 states have them. And I think this is an attempt, because both of these came out in February of this year. This is an attempt to tighten. No, that's what we need to do. We need to tighten them. This is an attempt to expand those that can legitimately have a weapon, keep their weapon, or that would have to give it up. So,
how much? Let me ask you this: we got less than 30 seconds left. How much of those two proposed bills are unconstitutional? I would say a great deal of them. Ladies and gentlemen, you've been listening to the Drive Time Sit Rep with the ever stellar Denise Simon. My name is Don Neuen. We sure do appreciate you joining us. This show, again, we're recording it on Monday, the 9th of September. It will air for the first time on September 11th. I think that there's no way that I can appropriately end this show, Denise.
I don't either.
I will leave it up to you.
Well, never forget. But you got to know what it is that it was all about, to not forget. God bless America, and thanks for being with us.
Check us out on the web at cowboylogic.us.